The new HBO series House of the Dragon is based on the book Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin, but it seems as if the writers are changing the book's canon history to lay the blame for House Targaryen's ruin at the feet of men. In the book, King Viserys is described as well-loved, and he's credited with overseeing many good things. But apparently the new writers have decided that it is all wrong. Should we be worried about the future of the show and for the accuracy of history in general? Let's dive in. What is new in the House of the Dragon series anyway? House of the Dragon is a new HBO series that's currently releasing in 2022. It's based on the book Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin, which is a history of House Targaryen. The show airs Sunday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. This show is a spin-off series of the wildly popular Game of Thrones show that aired on HBO from 2011 to 2019. The new series is set about 300 years before the event of Game of Thrones, and it chronicles the rise and fall of House Targaryen. This is supposed to be a fascinating story, as the House of Targaryen was the most powerful family in Westeros for many centuries. They had dragons and they used them to conquer most of the continent, but then, about 150 years before the events of Game of Thrones, something went wrong. Through civil war and turmoil, the Targaryens lost their grip on Westeros, and then about 100 years before Game of Thrones, they were overthrown completely and forced into exile. So, why are the writers changing things? It seems as if the writers are changing the book history to lay the blame for House Targaryen's ruin at the feet of men. In the book, King Viserys is described as well-loved, and he's credited with overseeing how many good things. But apparently the new writers have decided this is all wrong. We see this come to light in House of the Dragon as Viserys tries to keep his small council meetings as conflict-free as possible and takes the advice of his hand often without question. When Condal and Sapchnik, the showrunners, were interviewed by Insider, they said that they wanted to tell this story through the female perspective specifically. It's possible that the writers are just trying to appeal to a more modern sensibility, or that they could be setting up a different story in the future. It's hard to say for sure, but either way, it's worrying for the accuracy of history in general. Although, there's nothing wrong with presenting this story from the female point of view. It seems like the writers are deliberately changing history to do so, whereas just presenting in one way would be okay. It seems like they're going out of their way to make King Viserys look bad and to shift the blame to man on general. So what exactly have the writers changed? In addition to changing King Viserys' character, it seems as if the writers have also changed some of the other characters in the story. For example, they've made Rhaenyra Targaryen into a more sympathetic character. In the book, she described as being ambitious and power-hungry, but in the show, she's been presented as someone who just wants to be the best for the family. The writers have also changed Alicent Hightower's character vastly from the book canon, showing that is definitely controversial, almost as much as the other changes they've made. The books never painted these characters in the light they're now being painted in, and there is no reason to change them other than to make a political statement. With that being said, some viewers actually think this is a good change, so it may not be all that bad. We'll just have to wait and see how the series plays out, but in the meantime, it's worrying to think about how much power the writers have to change history in order to fit their own agenda. Next up, how did the writers defend this change? When Condal and Sapchnik were interviewed by Insider, they said that they wanted to tell this story through the female perspective specifically. Sapchnik said that one of the things we need to do is listen to women because otherwise we are all making it up. With that being said, it's definitely interesting to consider that the perspective of the people doesn't ultimately change the story, and that the story is still being presented in a way that's not accurate to history insofar so the books are concerned. The show writer did not go to say that they were presenting the story from the omniscient perspective, saying, quote, "We get to be as the god-eye point of view in the story, telling the objective truth. We get to show these moments." But it's hard to see how they can truly be objective when they're making so many changes to the source material. Only time will tell how all this plays out, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on for both lovers of the original book and fans of canon historical accuracy. And now, how are these changes made apparent in the first episode? Some of the changes were made apparent in the first episode through dialogue and character interactions. In fact, Condal and his writing team let viewers know that this TV adaptation will not only fill in the gaps and events found in Fire and Blood, but correct the notion that the beginning of the end of House Targaryen was the fault of two women. Interestingly though, the question becomes how much can be blamed on Viserys when he's surrounded by advisors, telling him what to do, as well as whether or not this correction made in the new show is accurate or just an adaptation to modern sensibilities. We see it now he is at fault for the first major fracture in the relationship between Alicent and Rhaenyra when he chose his daughter's peer and best friend to be his new bride. Throughout the hunting episode, Viserys also failed to counteract the realm's perception of Rhaenyra as entitled and unworthy to rule compared to a male child. It's fascinating that the show tries to display it as Viserys' fault for the fracture in their relationship, relationship between Alicent and Rhaenyra, as well as for the negative perception of Rhaenyra. Then he was getting counsel from others on what to do. During the hunting episode, it seemed as if Viserys was being set to fail from the beginning. In fact, it was shown that he failed to counteract the realm's perception of Rhaenyra as unworthy to rule, so this definitely is an interesting take on that. So, how is the book version of King Viserys different from the show? The book version of King Viserys is different as night and day when it comes to the stark contrast with the show version. In the books, King Viserys is described as well-loved, and he's given credit for overseeing the apex of House Targaryen's power in Westeros, something that the HBO adaptation is failing to show. On the other hand, the HBO adaptation is giving us a story that includes his daughter and second wife's perspective, and we see a whole different story play out of the patriarchal kingdom. While it's true the Viserys actions led to the first major fracture in the relationship between Alicent and Rhaenyra, as well as the negative perception of Rhaenyra, one could argue that this was only shown for the convenience of the show. So are there any upsides to the changes? Although it's clear that these changes are definitely controversial, let's not forget that there are always two sides to every story. Some viewers actually think that these changes are good, and that they make the story more interesting. It's definitely true that the show is more focused on the female perspective, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's possibly that the writers are just trying to make an appeal to more modern sensibility, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either. It's also worth noting that many shows, movies, and books have subverted expectation in a similar manner in the past and were met with critical acclaim, so it's possible that these changes could actually end up being good for the show in the long run. A great example of this, Maleficent from Disney's Sleeping Beauty. In the original story, Maleficent is just a one-dimensional villain, but in the live-action movie, she's given a much more nuanced character arc, and many viewers thought that this made her a more interesting and sympathetic character. So it's possible that these changes to House of the Dragon could actually end up being good for the show in the long run, and could make for a more interesting and nuanced story. Only time will tell. But what do you think? Thanks for watching the video, though I'm sure we'll have more to say on the topic in the future. In the meantime, what do you think about the changes that the writers have made? Do you think they're good or bad? This is definitely a controversial topic and could go either way depending on what your stance on the show is. Do you think it's a bold but great change, or do you think the change is lackluster and showcases the one-dimensional view of the writers? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching.